He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Let's go to this corrections story. There are fears that some criminals won't end up in jail after reports that Wellington police were told to, quote, carefully consider making arrests because Rimutaka prison was nearly full.
That was Ryan Bridge on the AM show back on the 17th of April, and those fears he spoke of there were sparked by a front-page story in the Herald on Sunday just the day before, under the headline,
"Exclusive, full prison prompts shock order."
The paper said that frontline police had been told to consider the necessity of arrests in some circumstances because the country's largest prison was almost full. Now, this claim was based on an email from a senior police sergeant to Wellington colleagues, which said that offenders arrested for breaching bail conditions might be remanded in police custody for a prolonged period due to Rimutaka prison being near maximum occupancy. And an unnamed police source then told the paper,
"I have no idea what the threshold is for being held in police custody now."
That's worrying stuff, and according to the Herald on Sunday, this directive would also be a headache for the Police Minister Jenny Anderson, because
law and order is shaping up as an election year battleground as Labour tries to deflect criticism it is soft on crime.
And some of that criticism was coming from the National Party's police spokesperson Mark Mitchell, who was pictured in the Herald on Sunday, along with this quote.
"We've reached a point where police officers are being asked to make arrest decisions based on government failures rather than public safety."
The ACT Party also responded to the story with a media statement, and later, a line in its law and order policy said this.
"Frontline prison officers are being told to think twice before arresting criminals because prisons, like Rimutaka, are too full."
But are they? The Herald on Sunday's exclusive also quoted a police spokesperson as saying that instruction from Wellington had not been introduced due to any capacity issues at any prison. The same day, Police Association President Chris Cahill told RNZ he was surprised to read Rimutaka prison was near capacity, given a decline in prison populations around the country, and Corrections Minister Kelvin Davis told Newshub there was still room for another 583 prisoners across prisons in New Zealand. Now, after referring to those fears about offenders at large on the AM show back on the 17th of April, presenter Ryan Bridge then echoed the minister's number like this.
But the Department of Corrections says there is enough capacity to manage anyone police decide it should be remanded in their custody. Corrections says Rimutaka prison has 750 beds for prisoners. 61 of those are currently vacant.
And after that, Corrections Acting National Commissioner Lee Marsh told Ryan Bridge this.
The reality is we've got nearly 600 vacancies across our network as our population's sitting around 8,450. So the reality is if someone needs to come to prison, they can come to prison. We've got plenty of space.
And Lee Marsh went on to say it's long been common practice to consider whether an offender breaching bail or warrant conditions really needs to be held in a police cell over long weekends if the risk of delaying arrest isn't really high. And Police Association President Chris Cahill told ZB something similar the same day.
The real issue is here, our police stations aren't the place to remand prisoners. So prisoners that are already, these aren't people who have breached their bail. These are people that are awaiting trial, serious charges. And, it's interesting that this is happening now when we've actually got a very low prison population. So to me, corrections should be managing their prisoners better.
Now, all this doesn't mean there are no problems with prison capacity these days, as the AM show's Ryan Bridge pointed out at the time.
Our prisons can currently house up to 9,020 inmates. That is down from the usual 9,561 because they haven't got enough staff.
And 1 month earlier, Stuff had reported that only one of the country's prisons, Christchurch Women's, is fully staffed these days, and Mount Eden Jail has more than 100 unfilled vacancies. And that's the reason the Corrections Department has spent more than $2.5 million this year on ad campaigns to recruit more officers. But back in mid-April, Rimutaka prison was not full, and offenders weren't at large because of it, as the Herald on Sunday's front page told readers at the time, as well as opposition politicians critical of the government's record. Now, in the 2 months since then, there have been many more worrying stories in the media about rising crime, and this past week was no exception.
Crime and law and order has really spiked since the last time they did this a couple of months ago. I think now about 40% of people are really worried about crime and law and order.
There was Stuff political editor Luke Malpass there talking about the latest Ipsos New Zealand Issues Monitor, picking up increased public concern about crime. as did his RNZ counterpart Jane Patterson alongside him on Morning Report's political wrap of the week last Friday.
Because since, if you look at that crime law and order finding from February 2022, it didn't even feature in the top 5, and you've just seen it really steadily climb up and now to be number 2. And look, you've had ram raids, you've got reports of violent crime, gangs, but also you've got that political focus and that campaign from National Soft on Crime. You've also had a lot of disruption in that police portfolio, a roll call of different ministers. Ginny Anderson, the new minister, under fire this week for comments that she made in relation to the extra police, the 1,800, about New Zealanders feeling safe, and Nationals picked up on that. So I think there's a political element too in terms of how people are feeling.
Well, how people are feeling about crime is one thing. Likewise, politicians responding with claims of soft on crime. But the hard facts change the story. Hayden Donnell now looks at efforts to put the news in crime in context using data for starters.
Really do encourage everyone who can make a difference to now make a difference. We've got a duty to keep customers and to keep teams safe in stores. And when you see retail crime up 38%, serious assaults up 36%, and repeat offenders being responsible for over a third of all reported retail crime, we absolutely have to acknowledge we have an issue, and now we need to look at every possible way we can solve the issue.
That's Foodstuff's Chief Executive Chris Quinn on RNZ's Morning Report earlier this week, raising the alarm about what he said is a scary rise in crime at the company's supermarkets. There were even reports that supermarket staff might need body cams. Some people raised their eyebrows at the timing of Quinn's media push, given a day earlier Consumer NZ had hit out at the supermarket giants over allegations they're ripping customers off with dodgy specials. But Quinn's not the first to air his concerns about rising retail crime in recent weeks. The owners of Titirangi's only post shop, Shrikant and Aboli Bave, did a series of media interviews in May saying they were closing their doors after 2 decades in business over repeated burglaries. Prime Minister Chris Hipkins was interviewed straight after the pair on AM and had this to say to Ryan Bridge.
I think it's absolutely heartbreaking and it is totally unacceptable. I absolutely acknowledge that the situation we're facing around retail crime at the moment, with ram raids and with aggravated robberies, is utterly unacceptable.
Those ram raids Hipkins mentioned dominated the headlines last year, with some media outlets reporting what they called a youth crime spike or youth crime wave. The barrage of coverage seems to have had an influence on people's perceptions of crime. On Monday this week, the Herald reported the results of an exclusive poll which showed 67% of New Zealanders are more concerned about being a victim of crime than they were 5 years ago. Respondents were also asked what action they want to see to address crime. The largest number, 34%, wanted harsher prison sentences, while 27% wanted more police. Just 4% wanted more social workers and other support, and 6% wanted a focus on rehabilitation rather than prison. These perceptions may be understandable given the real rise in headline-grabbing types of crime like ram raids. But they don't always mesh with the data released by authorities. Police numbers showed youth crime was actually down 2% year on year in 2022, though there were big rises in South Auckland and Canterbury. Some of the tough-on-crime solutions favoured by the public also clash with the evidence on what makes people safer. For instance, last year polling showed 70% of people support the idea of putting serious youth offenders in year-long boot camps. University of Canterbury sociologist and gangs researcher Jared Gilbert looked at the studies, bringing together all the data on boot camps around the world, and came to this conclusion on TVNZ's Breakfast.
The research shows, the data shows quite clearly that these programs have very limited success or no success, and in rare occasions actually make the problems worse. Now, on that last point, I mean, I was kind of interested in that because how does a program make something worse? And the shorthand is, and we hear it and we've heard it in the media in the last day or two, is that we make fitter, faster young criminals.
Many of the daily stories on crime don't include that kind of context or expert comment, and some commentators have aired concerns that the unrelenting flow of alarming headlines is presenting the public with a distorted picture. Here's criminologist Trevor Bradley on Stuff's daily news podcast, Newsable.
In the local area, regardless of whether it was a high crime community or not, because they had access to lots of different sources of information, including talking to neighbours and friends and colleagues or whatever, they had a much, better appreciation of the kind of level of risks that they were exposed to. Whereas, when we asked them about their perceptions of crime in other parts of the country, they were much more inclined to say that, yes, that's a big problem. Why? Well, because they were relying on national media, essentially. And so their picture of crime was not experiential. It was totally kind of learned or gleaned from the media.
Last week, a pair of New Zealand Herald reporters laid out their best effort to get to the reality behind the crime reports. Under the headline, "Is Labour really soft on crime?" the numbers reveal a surprising story. Data journalist Chris Knox and political reporter Michael Nielsen collated stats from what they described as a vast array of sources on crime rates in New Zealand over the last 43 years. They found reported victims of crime were up 11.9% since Labour came to power, while the number of offenders arrested is down 25.4% and convictions are down 26.2%. So far, so good for those saying crime is out of control and Labour is failing to stop it. But Knox and Nielsen present a lot of nuance behind their findings. They say much of the increase in reported retail crime, for instance, is due to a new system that allows retailers to automatically notify police of minor offences that may previously have gone unreported. And when it comes to charges and convictions, John Key's national government oversaw an even greater drop than Labour under Jacinda Ardern. I asked the two to explain what drew them to a data investigation on crime and what news organisations could do to improve how they report on such a thorny, complicated topic. Kia ora, Michael and Chris. Welcome to Mediawatch.
Kia ora, Hayden. Good to be here.
Yeah, kia ora, Hayden. Thanks.
So why did you do this investigation?
We would look back in December. We were thinking about things that we thought would be key election issues, to spend some time looking at the data behind some of those issues. A lot of kind of data sets are kind of simple at first glance, but there's a whole lot of background. And so we thought it would be a useful contribution to an election year to kind of have, I guess, a go-to explainer on a few topics, and crime was one of them.
Michael, I think you tweeted something like that you just got sick of being asked to do fact checks on political claims about crime.
Working in the press gallery, we're constantly getting bombarded, with media releases and statements from politicians, and we're seeing an increasing trend in the use of terms like soft on crime, and this government needs to get tough on crime, and be using statistics from various sources, from police, from justice, to try and tell that story, to add to that kind of atmosphere of crime getting out of control. But certain cases we would look into those stats and we'd find actually if you show it in a bigger context, it tells quite a different story. One good example was around retail crime. The numbers are definitely exploding. I mean, they've tripled the reports in retail crime under Labour government. But when you look into the way that it's reported, it became a lot easier for stores to report low-level shoplifting offences that previously weren't being reported. So we found with that context, it made it more difficult to paint that picture. And we also found the same with ram raids data, both political parties, Labour and National, using different months to kind of compare a rise or a fall in those stats. So we were kind of getting frustrated at constantly having to fact check these and the flaws in some of their data, and that sort of fed into working with Chris to do a broader piece.
That's the perception out there. Crime is out of control. There's these allegations that Labour is soft on crime. That's the context of your piece. How much did you find those claims marry up with your analysis of the data?
One of the most revealing things, for me anyway, was looking back at the longer term trends and seeing some of the things we might associate with a soft on crime government, so lower charging rates and conviction rates. And looking back at the longer term trend, we could see in this Labour government a decrease, but under the previous National government a much greater decrease. The previous Labour government under Helen Clark, there was an increase in that as well. The National government before that, there was actually a decrease as well. So it kind of challenged the view that Labour is always soft, National's always tough findings. So in the longer term, these claims don't really marry up with the stats. And then in the shorter term, I think there's definitely evidence that the government is taking what might be seen as a softer approach. So in terms of sentencing, potentially some slight tweaks there, and looking at alternative sentences to prison. But again, those trends started before this Labour government. So we saw similar trends under John Key's government. Obviously, there was an increase in the prison population, but in many other areas, there was a less punitive approach taken.
There's a sense with crime, even if the narrative out there in the public is wrong, does it really matter? It's almost something that's based on feeling. For instance, Jared Gilbert, he was asked to fact check some of the claims about the efficacy of boot camps last year, and he found that they weren't very effective, according to meta-studies globally, but he acknowledged he probably wasn't going to convince anyone about that because just the idea of tougher action intuitively feels right to people.
Because they just instinctively sound good to the public, and I absolutely get that. But that doesn't change those data that show that they're just not successful.
Is there an extent to which you can scream out the data and the nuance until you're blue in the face, but it won't really win anyone over?
I think that is partly true. I think that people's reaction to crime and to feeling under threat is obviously a strongly emotional reaction. Responding to that with facts and figures isn't necessarily going to, as you say, change anyone's mind. I think that's not a reason not to have a kind of a thorough discussion of the data and to try and put it out there as part of this discussion. I think it cuts the other way as well, like we saw in Hawke's Bay around trying to use data to kind of rubbish people's claims that there was a threat of crime or crime was happening in the aftermath of Cyclone Gabriel. I think that was a good example of how not to use data.
You could be seen as insensitive in this way because we see a lot of coverage of victims of retail crime a lot lately, people having to close their businesses. Are you worried that responding to that with data or nuance can seem insensitive?
Yes, we do worry about that. We certainly don't want to come across as saying, well, the crime that you've experienced is 1 out of 10,000, so it doesn't matter. That's kind of the opposite of what we're trying to do.
I think to add to that as well, one of the big conclusions that we drew was that it is really hard to paint a big picture, to make bold claims about what's happening with crime based on the data. So in a way, it is speaking to, it is surveys of society, how people feel, it is perceptions, how safe people feel, it is speaking to victims, and it is also looking at offenders and things like rehabilitation and how effective that is. I mean, those are all potentially better ways to look at crime in society rather than just cherry picking a couple of stats to show a 40% increase in one type of offending over a certain type of period. It's kind of more of a broader perception, and obviously there's difficulties with that when measuring that because things like media reporting obviously do play into that, and things like social media, the prevalence of crime can often be different to the reality.
The media. So you mentioned in your story, for instance, that ram raids, they're a tiny fraction of crime, but obviously they're a huge focus of media coverage, and that seems almost inevitable. They're such a headline-grabbing type of crime, and it's kind of hard to say just don't cover that. But at the same time, covering a small percentage of crime is going to give people a distorted picture of the overall crime rates. How do you deal with that?
And as you say, these stories, it's I think we'd be doing a disservice not to report some of these because we are definitely seeing a spike, and whatever you attribute it to, it's a lot of people say it's this post-COVID situation. We've had an increase in truancy in schools, and that's led to more youth out, and so there's a real issue there that we need to highlight. Maybe the way that we do it, but maybe also just to every now and then include that context that it's not part of a broader trend. It is a spike.
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally one of the answers to this kind of thing, not just in crime, but kind of in general, is more data journalism. I think that I've had a discussion with one of our journalists who basically says that kind of one of the purposes of journalism is to talk about the rare events so that people kind of understand their lives aren't like that. The flip side of that is that data journalism kind of exists to tell you what is and isn't a rare event. And so the challenge for us is how to make that interesting, and also how do we do it in a way that doesn't lose our readers on line 3.
Yeah, Michael, well, you're a day-to-day journalist normally. You're not always working with Chris on these kinds of large-scale data projects. Do you feel that perhaps by reporting something you might be giving readers a distorted picture?
I have definitely felt that throughout my career at certain points. I mean, right now I work in the press gallery in politics, and I feel that pressure a lot less in that environment compared to maybe a live news environment. I would also say, I mean, just speaking for our own company, we're moving into the premium news space. I think overall there's less of a pressure to chase clicks as there might have been previously, and it's allowed us to do stories like Chris and I have just done. But I don't know if it can ever go away. You know, based on audience numbers, these stories are inherently interesting. They grab people's attention. So it's probably just needs to be a stock take of how often we're doing them, how prominent we're making them, how much it marries up with the stats and also the context and the way that we report them. I think it is possible. It'll take just a bit of reflection.
Yeah, and I think the other context to remember is, like, for example, with ram raids, that became a prominent kind of media issue. The police weren't even collecting that as an offence type. When the media first started talking about ram raids and they started showing up every day in Auckland, there wasn't the data there to find out whether or not this was there. And so when, as a result of essentially media pressure or media focus, the police did go back and figure out a way of kind of classifying that as a crime or a class of crime, then it was apparent that, yes, there had been an increase. So almost I think the media is harder on itself than it needs to be in this context. I think that sometimes the things that we focus on do actually kind of bring about change.
With crime in general, the data doesn't seem to be being collated and collected very well, or it's being collected in different forms by different agencies. One of your main takeaways from this investigation was just how hard this investigation was. Do you think that we need better ways of surveying and recording crime?
We do. The Justice Department actually does do a very good survey, which they started in 2018, I believe. So the 5th iteration of that survey is coming out sometime in June, so watch this space. But one of the things that kind of one of the challenges for me again is how do we actually turn like that rich set of information that the Justice Department will release into something that grabs our readers and actually kind of, so that's been sitting there, available for a few years. So I'm hoping to see kind of more discussion of that survey.
Can we get a verdict? The central question of your investigation is Labor. The headline of the story is Labor soft on crime. Is crime out of control?
So it's a very political question. I think it's quite safe to say crime is not out of control. That's just a. There's certain types of crime that are definitely of high concern. Ram raids for sure, and there's definitely been an increase in retail crime, even though there's been better reporting. Family harm continues to be by far the biggest offence category, so it's still very concerning. I just think that calling it out of control is probably going a bit too far. And is Labor soft? I think it doesn't appear to be particularly softer than the previous national government. That would be my take.
Yeah, I mean, I basically say you can't reliably draw conclusions from reported crime statistics. That's not kind of what they exist for. And as as we've seen, things like ram rates have increased. Whether I think also that the this Labour government's kind of followed in the same type of policy in policing and justice decisions as the previous national government, with the exception of they have focused on reducing the prison population, which was an election kind of promise they made, and they've carried on doing. Yeah, I mean, I have a rule, around data journalism that one number on its own is almost always misleading, and I think that applies very much here. Crime numbers are numbers that need to be looked at in context and understood.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Aidan. Appreciate
Thanks
it.
a lot.
That was Michael Nielsen, senior political reporter for the New Zealand Herald, and the Herald's data editor Chris Knox, talking there to Mediawatch's Hayden Donnell.